I think it's just a nature of the way the world is and reality is that a soul or jiva can't be free and like controlled.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I would just say that the nature of reality or the world is just such that even like Krishna, like he's not above that principle. But I would just say that's that's sort of okay because no one can be above these principles, and it's not like a fault on Krishna that he's not able to like warp reality to make it so that these laws can be violated.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Free Radical Podcast. Today, I've had the chance of meeting Vaishnava scholar Adi Purusha. Adi Purusha is currently serving as the Hindu chaplain at Wake Forest University. He received a PhD from the University of Cambridge, and his research has focused on the problem of evil, Vedanta, philosophy of religion, and ethics. He also taught at the College of William and Mary as a visiting assistant professor from 2022 to 2023. So today with Adi Purusha, we had a very interesting conversation about the problem of evil and how to address it in the context of spirituality. How an omnibenevolent God, who is also generally considered as omnipotent and omniscient, how the problem of evil, suffering in the world can coexist with those divine attributes, and how in between all this, from the Gaudiya Vaishnava perspective, we can speak about karma, we can speak about suffering, we can speak about the redeeming purpose of suffering in a way that is not justifying or promoting suffering in an unhealthy way. Many related interested topics. As you may recall, a few months ago already, we have had Thomas Jai Ort in our podcast, and we have been talking about this from his particular open relational theology from the Christian perspective, how an all benevolent God can allow evil, or does he allow evil? Is he omnipotent or not according to his view? So now we are entertaining one possibility of the Gaudiya tradition lenses in this connection, but I must make the point clear, there are not one final conclusive stance, whether in the Christian tradition, whether in the Gaudiya tradition, whether in other traditions. So when I personally invite someone like Thomas Jai Ort or Adi Purusha in this case, of course, to talk about the same topic, I'm not necessarily, or to any guest in my podcast on any topic, I'm not inviting someone who necessarily agrees with everything I think about, or vice versa. I do not necessarily may subscribe to everything my guest may think about. And I think that's an important point, not only to clarify, but actually for me, that's one of the most interesting reasons to invite someone to my podcast. Not to agree on everything necessarily, but to learn how to appreciate our differences and not only tolerate each other, but love each other, learn from each other despite potential differences of opinion. So this will be a very interesting exchange in this regard. You're more than welcome to join. This is the Free Radical Podcast. To support it as well, please subscribe it by clicking on the bell. And if you feel nourished by the conversation, feel free to share it, like it, and share your comments to keep the conversation ongoing. Without further ado, dear friends, here is Adi Purusha. So, welcome, Adi Purusha Prabhu. Thanks so much for joining us in the Free Radical Podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
My pleasure. So, where to begin? As a human being, probably you are dedicating a big part of your life now to your family, to your wife, to your forthcoming baby. As a Gaudiya Vaishnava, you are dedicating yourself to God, to Krishna and his service. And as a scholar, you have invested deeply your time, your life deeply in questions of theodicy. So maybe we can start there. Why do you consider this theme so central and so worthy of your life's attention, your life's care, your life's intellect?
Yeah, so when I was I think master's student, it would have been a master's student. I heard a lecture from my guru, and he said that you can do a whole dissertation just on how Krishna arranges difficult circumstances for his devotees to purify them. Like just in the Bhagavatam, that theme, you could do a whole dissertation on it. And so at the time, I was really thinking of what I wanted to write even my master's thesis on. And so I like that idea. And I tried to do my master's thesis on something like that. I ended up changing trajectories a little bit, but I still had that desire to work on that topic. And so when I applied for graduate school, I proposed that as a topic for some of the places I applied to. And I ended up getting into Cambridge. And so when I went to Cambridge, my advisor, he knew I was interested in that topic. And he sent me a lot of other things on just the problem of evil in general. And initially, I thought I'd just sort of focus on that one specific theme of how Krishna arranges difficulties for devotees. But as I began working on it, it really made more sense to work on the problem of evil more generally. And it's a hot topic in like philosophical, religious circles, and our tradition has a lot to say about it. And so as I began working on it, I found that it was actually quite a good topic. And yeah, it has a lot of personal relevance for the lives of devotees or really anyone in general. And it's also, yeah, just philosophically, it's an interesting topic to work on, even from the standpoint of just like intellectual stimulation. A lot has been said on it. I learned a lot in the process of working on it, and it really deepened my own like philosophical understanding, deepened my like even critical thinking skills. And yeah, it's nice to explore tradition in more depth. I mean, I knew, we have a kind of generic answer, but when you really get into get deep into the weeds, you see, like, you learn a lot in the process of working on it. So it's been a really good topic. And yeah, I think also nowadays, I mean, it's been like this for some time now, but we live in a time where theists kind of have been put on the defensive a little bit. Because now, before maybe theism or believing in God was just like the default view that was like the default view. You just kind of grew up believing in God. But now, there's all these objections to God's existence. There's, people are questioning whether there's evidence for God's existence, whether it's rational. So the problem of evil is sort of seen as one of the main objections to theism. So it's also, in addressing that, you sort of also clear away one of the main intellectual hurdles to accepting some idea of theism as well. So I think it has some relevance there as well.
It does. Thank you. And yes, we were talking in a recording we made a few days ago with Thomas Jayor, as I mentioned to you also. We were talking how this problem of evil sometimes is the main reason for people not to embrace spirituality or not to believe in God or to leave their faith altogether because of the thorny questions that come in the context of how to harmonize the existence of an all-benevolent divine, also considered as omnipotent, omniscient, and evil or suffering. I think you use and we'll be using in our conversation the word evil and suffering as basically the same things, just for our listeners to have an idea. And also I appreciate your point on your journey in trying to study what our Gaudiya tradition has to say about it. Of course, we also realize, okay, there is no orthodox form Gaudiya theodicy as such, probably. But of course, when we go to the scriptures, we find so much about it. But of course, they need to be, for that to be put in a certain way that makes sense and that helps us to deal with thorny questions. And I don't personally like to, how to say, especially in a topic like this one, to go for easy answers. I give you a one-liner and that's all. Krishna is loving, karma is their karma, next topic, because there's so much in between that. So I'm glad that you were highlighting that in that connection. So if you allow me, Adi Purusha, I'd like to begin or continue what we are talking about now, sharing an interesting set of premises that you yourself shared in one of the papers that you wrote, that you shared with me, that I think will help me and us as the listeners to have a more clear idea why theodicy is so necessary, why addressing this particular theme is so necessary, especially, I would say, for those who believe in God's existence, not only defending our faith to those who challenge it, but for us to have a robust well-sustained faith and not just pure sentimental blind belief, so to say. So you set a set of 7 points, if I'm not mistaken. I will read them quickly, if you allow me, and then we can elaborate on that. So you say, first, God, a supremely personal being, is conceived of as a being who is omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient. First premise. Second, an omnipotent being has the ability to prevent all evil or suffering, as we clarified. Third, an omnibenevolent being wants to prevent all evil. Fourth, an omniscient being knows how evil can come into existence and how it can be prevented. 5, a being that has the ability to prevent evil and wants to prevent evil and knows how evil can be prevented will indeed prevent evil. 6, but evil does exist. 7, so an omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent being must not exist. That's kind of the Purva Paksha opposing view of the argument. So conclusion, if an omnibenevolent, omnipotent, omniscient being must not exist, therefore God must not exist. So that's the beginning, right? And yet, of course, then you define in that paper, I think, theodicy, just in case for those who do not know, you refer to another author who defines theodicy as an attempt to identify God's morally sufficient reasons or purposes for allowing evil, right? So in this connection, one thing that comes to my mind, I would like to ask you, theodicy, at least classical theodicy, seems to be an explanation of why God allows evil rather than a defense of how evil can occur without compromising God's classical attributes. Am I on the right page?
Yeah. Basically, theodicy in a nutshell is basically trying to explain why God would allow, or even, I guess you could also extend it into like cause suffering for so many people. And to kind of address that argument, basically, if you can identify like some good reasons for why we see so much suffering in the world, it basically like kind of diffuses the objection to a certain extent. You might feel some tension, or you might feel a little bit uneasy with some of the responses, but at least if you give a good of a response as you can, it at least helps reduce the sting of that problem of evil to a significant extent, maybe.
So, but also in connection to what I mentioned before, on one side we may have something that, an explanation of why God allows or even causes evil, while in some other cases, like I think you referred to Alvin Plantinga's free will defense, that will be more of a defense where he says, God values free will. Free will entails the possibility of evil, and therefore evil can exist even if God is totally good and omnipotent, right? So the above, it may not be considered as a theodicy, at least in the classical sense, explaining why God allows evil, but more of a defense, right? Like, it's logically possible for God and evil to coexist.
Yeah, philosophers kind of make a distinction between a defense and a theodicy, and the defense is maybe weaker, like it doesn't prove as much, but it does try to show that at least like God's existence and evil can be, or suffering can be, logically consistent. A theodicy maybe is like more fleshed out, but some people also, some scholars also argue that like, they challenge that understanding of defenses and theodicy a little bit, but kind of what's important for us is that like it's an attempt to block the problem of evil. And Plantinga's free will defense, he presented it quite early, and it's based on the idea of free will and just how an omnipotent God like can't control people and give them free will. So evil exists partly as a result of free will. A lot of people aren't satisfied with just free will on its own, but at least at least that point is important, that like if there's an omnipotent God, even an omnipotent God can't do things that are logically impossible. And giving someone free will, but then controlling their every action so that they don't suffer, like that's logically impossible. So even an omnipotent being can't do that. And so free will at least comes in as one way to explain why there could be so much evil. Philosophers after Plantinga have sort of tried to elaborate a little bit more on that idea. They commonly appeal to like the idea that suffering can also build character or deepen relationships.
Or something along those lines. Which are your thoughts in terms of, you were mentioning, okay, God, if we consider God as omnipotent, and in a minute I'd like to go to the thinking of some theologians from other traditions probably that may declare he's not omnipotent either. But if we consider God as omnipotent, and you were referring to God some may say he can even do what is logically impossible, in the sense of what is logically impossible for us may not be logically impossible for him. But I recall having a conversation with Satyaraj Prabhu on this theme. He recently wrote an article also on the topic. He will tell me, okay, we can even accept that God can do what is logically impossible for us, but he liked to make a difference between the logical impossible and the absurd. Like, for example, God cannot stop being God. That he won't call that even illogical. He will call that like absurd. That it doesn't make sense. That the very proposal. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's some differences of opinion on what it means for God to be all-powerful, and the sort of view that a lot of, if not pretty much the vast majority of philosophers say, is that there's some limit as to what a all-powerful being can do. One kind of natural limit is like even an omnipotent being can't do something that's logically impossible, like make a square circle. Like the idea of a square circle is just a logical contradiction. Like it just can't be done, even by someone who's
hornless unicorn, right? This type of example.
Yeah, hornless unicorn, or like.
Which are your thoughts on this famous example by creating a rock so heavy he cannot lift?
Yeah, they call that the paradox of the stone. Like, can God create a rock so heavy he can lift it? And I mean, it generally, I mean, I do think that at some point, even as a theist, you have to say that like there's some things even God can't do. And Prabhupada also mentions this. He says like Krishna can't give us free will, and then at the same time like control our actions so that we don't do anything wrong. Because someone who's free and controlled, that's like a contradiction. You can't have that. Even God can't make that happen.
Yeah.
So I agree with that. I think there's maybe you might also say that Krishna, he's all powerful, but he also doesn't do anything that goes against his goodness either. Like he could like cause a lot of horrible pointless suffering if he wanted to, but he just would never do that because it goes against his goodness. So I guess you could also say there's some other constraints on even God's power, just because there's some things that he wouldn't do just because it's like kind of like doesn't make sense to do them.
But also you make this difference that okay, there may be some things that he could do but he wouldn't do, but also there are things he cannot do. Like you were saying, he cannot stop being God. He cannot stop being love. As you were talking, he's all loving. It's not that he could just suddenly become something else but what he is, or just things like that, right?
Yeah, that's good.
I'm sharing that story because sometimes in the name of pushing omnipotence, as you say, we may end up with as I like to call, hyperbolic definition of omnipotence that in one sense start to make God less omnipotent than what he actually is. It starts to create more problems and limitations and contradictions. So, I think when I go to the absurd thing, okay, he can do the logical impossible. I have no problem with that, but there are certain things that will be basically absurd. Krishna cannot stop existing, so to say. He cannot stop loving the gopis. Our tradition, so to say.
I guess I would say, there's two things Krishna wouldn't do. He wouldn't do like absurd things, and I also would say if it's logically impossible, then Krishna wouldn't do that either. I mean, it could be true that there's some things that we can't do, but he can do. Like I can't like expand my body into several like different bodies and like be all over the place, but Krishna can. But I don't think that's like a logical impossible thing. It's maybe there's just something impossible for us, but not for God.
So as I was mentioning a moment ago, there are some theologians who may disagree a little bit with this word allowing, in terms of like, okay, God could, as in his omnipotence, he could do anything and everything, but in certain cases or situations, he allows some things or does not allow. So some theologians, again, like Thomas J. Orr that I interviewed recently, he will say like God is not omnipotent. That's his stance. I have a different view, though it's connected in certain ways. But he says God cannot do certain things. He will define God as not omnipotent, but omnipotent. I personally will emphasize, I wouldn't cancel omnipotence, but I will just emphasize a redefinition of omnipotence as a qualified or nuanced omnipotence in terms of what we were talking now. Like there are certain absurd things that even an omnipotent God cannot do, not because he's not so omnipotent, but because it doesn't make any sense, basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
But before going to a point that I want to go, let me play. I mean, you already play a good amount of Purva Paksha with your different points. Let me play myself a little further Purva Paksha in terms of some of the initial premises you shared. You say, okay, we assume that God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent. As a Gaudiya Vaishnava practitioner that you are, that I am, how will you, let's go to the omnipotence point. How will you justify scripturally that God is omnipotent?
Yeah, I have a paper where I try to give some references. There's also, my dissertation discusses this, but like one verse says that Krishna is like Ananta Shakti. He's got like unlimited power. I mean, he's the controller of everything. Everything depends on him. Everything rests on him, like pearls are strung on a thread. Prabhupada says a lot of things about that as well. It's kind of all over the place. But I think,
for example, in terms of Ananta Shakti, that he has unlimited potencies, could that not be also understood that, okay, he has unlimited potencies, but that doesn't mean that he has unlimited power to do anything and everything in the sense of,
you might say that his,
again, I'm playing the Purva Paksha, right?
I think in that case, Shakti can also mean strength. It doesn't necessarily mean like Krishna's Shaktis or energies. But I would say unlimited strength means ability to do whatever is logically possible. And even with regards to things that would go against God's goodness, like I don't think God would ever like cause someone unnecessary suffering, or suffering that is like has no justifiable reason. I think he could if he had wanted to, like in terms of his ability, like actual like ability to do that. I think he could do that. It's just as a self-imposed constraint on himself, he wouldn't. But had he wanted to do it, he could. So I guess from that perspective, he does have like the power and ability to do it. He just would never do it as a matter because of like his all goodness also. But yeah, basically whatever is logically possible to do is sort of possible for God to do. I think that's maybe the best interpretation of having unlimited power.
I see. So I hear you repeatedly resorting to this expression, what is logically possible, he can do it. So how will you respond to someone saying, okay, what's the difference between what is logically possible for us and what is logically possible for God? Because we always hear things like, okay, tarko pratishtana, logic is not the end of everything, and if we try to limit our own sense of logic is one thing, maybe God's sense of logic is something different. So how will you reply to that like argument that, okay, you are like, if someone, so to say, accuses you of, okay, you are saying that God is limited to what is logically possible for us, but what if he has his own logic and things make sense in a different way for him, and that's how reality is operating, and we actually do not need to limit the absolute to our own limited sense of logic?
Well, there's three kind of logical laws that people often talk about. There's the law of excluded middle. So something is either true or false, but there's no sort of in between. There's the law of non-contradiction, where something can't be true and false in the same way at the same time. Like some ball can't be red and green at the same time. Like it's either red. I mean, you could maybe have a red half or a green half, but it can't be red all over or green all over. It has to be either one. So you can't be X or not X at the same time. Law of excluded middle, law of non-contradiction, law of identity, I think, is another one. So something is like identical to itself. And so these laws, I guess, I mean, we can call them laws for now. Like they hold sort of regardless, they're sort of like objective principles of like reality, I guess you can say.
Mm.
And so those constraints, I guess, would apply like across the board. So like, we can't make contradictions happen because that would violate logical law. And I guess if you say that, God is sort of beyond logic and God is not subject to these constraints. I mean, some theologians and philosophers have maybe taken that stance, but like, I don't think it's really clear that that makes sense. Like, I think maybe it's just like an objective fact of just the way the world is, that something can't like be X and like not X at the same time. And like, I think with free will, like, I think it's just a nature of the way the world is and reality is that a soul or jiva can't be free and like controlled. And I guess I would just say that the nature of reality or the world is just such that even like Krishna, like he's not above that principle. But I would just say that's that's sort of okay, because no one can be above these principles, and it's not like a fault on Krishna that he's not able to like warp reality to make it so that these laws can be violated.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that, because of course in our particular tradition we have our official metaphysics are called Ved, right? So someone will say, you are saying someone cannot be free and not free, but our metaphysics called difference and non-difference. So, but there's a way of explaining difference and non-difference in a way it's paradoxical, but it's not ultimately contradictory. And at the same time, we can say, yeah, but there are some things that cannot be at the same time, again, existent and non-existent. Or whatever. So I think it's important to make the difference, not to just bring this idea sentimentally to justify one thing or the other, right? Like one thing in the sense that anything and everything can happen, and there's no fixed parameter for anything, or becoming too rigid and black and white in every single department of reality. So knowing how and when to apply this. So you were mentioning, Adi Purusha, about 1 moment ago, okay, a soul has free will, so it makes no sense that a soul at one point or doesn't have free will. It will be like basically a contradiction. And a few minutes before that, you were speaking about Krishna, like the possibility of God bestowing suffering on someone if he will like or consider. But my question comes, how doesn't get in the way of one's free will? In other words, let's say I'm not a devotee, I'm not relating to God, because I think also, and we may go there in a moment, it's important to make a difference. Okay, how God relates to a bhakta and how God relates to those who choose not to relate to him, basically. There may be some similarities and some differences. So let's talk about someone who is not relating to the divine and is just acting in the perimeter of karma, so to say. There is no spiritual influence included, in the sense that the person is not embracing bhakti, loving God, transcending the gunas by the shelter of bhakti. So that person is receiving the results of their actions. So in that case, you will say that God can sometimes create some suffering or cause some suffering for that person, or will you say that suffering is caused by that person's very own free will and the and results of that? Because if God on top of that intervenes and causes suffering, how much that is not canceling the soul's free will and becomes then the contradiction we were talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I agree. Like, if Krishna were to just intervene in someone's life and cause them unnecessary, pointless suffering without their consent, I think, one, Krishna would harm that person by just creating the suffering in general, and two, Krishna would violate that person's free will, which I would say Krishna just doesn't do, because it wouldn't be beneficial for Krishna to override our free will, because we're ultimately better off with it. So that's why Krishna doesn't just randomly intervene. If there's a devotee who calls out to him, at that point he can intervene, because then that devotee wants Krishna to. So that's sort of one point. And then the second point is, when there's karma, yeah, like it's not that when you suffer because of your karma, like Krishna's just like causing you suffering, and like you're he's like interfering with your free will, and you're getting something even though you like Krishna's just messing with you even though you didn't ask him to do it. I would say with karma, like basically the suffering is in one sense like due to one's own actions. So it's not like there's another agent imposing their will or force on someone. It's sort of like the suffering is ultimately like not something that is like done by someone else. So in that sense, there's no violation of free will.
That the suffering could be defined as a confirmation of your free will, so to say.
Yeah, I mean, you could look
And
at
it's
it.
indicating that you have a choice, you made certain choices, and you're reaping the fruits of that, right?
Yeah.
And also, what I was thinking is, and what it's that if Krishna were to intervene again in a way that is somehow altering my free will or altering the results of my actions without me inviting him to intervene in my life, that will again cancel what the jiva is. Because, for example, I recall Jiva Goswami's, he gives in the Paramatma Sandarbha 21 intrinsic qualities of the soul, like basically defining what jiva and atma is. And one is bhaktritva, another is kartritva. So basically meaning that the jiva, the soul, has experiential capacity, it has agency. So basically, if a soul is deprived of that, even for a moment, by God's intervention, what to speak of God's uninvited intervention, that will, for that moment, that soul will stop being what it is, because those qualities are intrinsic to the constitution of the soul, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Krishna Bhagavad Gita says in chapter 2, whatever exists will always exist, whatever does not exist will never exist. So in one sense, it's not possible for the soul to stop being what it is.
Yeah, that's true. Krishna would interfere with our agency and who we are as like at the very core of our being if he were to just violate our free will.
If you allow me, as I share some of the set of premises that you presented as a problem to address and solve in theological terms, I'd like to share with you a brief set of premises that I myself included in a chapter in a book I'm writing that I shared with you some days ago, which may not fit absolutely with the traditional theodicy in every sense. Maybe it may be described more as a more relational, or I like to call sometimes kenotic theodicy, while at the same time trying to keep in place the main core Gaudiya Vaishnava definitions of what God is, what the soul is, and so on. So I may like to share it and hear your thoughts on that. So those are mostly 7 points. So it says, first of all, God cannot cease to be God. Again, going back to the potential absurdity. God cannot cease to be God because that will contradict his essential eternal nature. It's not that he chooses not to cease to be God. He cannot do that. Then, since God is love, and that's described not only in the Bible or other traditions, even in ours, Rasovai, Saha, many other statements. So since God is love, he cannot cease to be love either, right? So I wouldn't say that love is one of God's qualities, but it's the very core of who God is. So
yeah, I might just say God is loving. I see love as like a relation between two people, but I would maybe, I mean, I agree with the point in essence, but yeah, I would just say God is loving.
Yeah. So then I will say love by nature. Now we go to the nature of love. In my opinion, and according to Shastra, of course, love is non-coercive, and therefore it cannot be forced, basically, right? Real love always grants the freedom to choose, honors free will, is a voluntary decision, and if it's imposed, it ceases to be love and becomes control or something. So far, we are on a similar page?
Yeah.
Okay. So therefore, considering all of the above, I will argue that God cannot not that chooses not to, but cannot override human freedom without negating love itself.
Yeah.
Because for love to remain love, it must allow the beloved to say no, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. And coercion in turns will turn, what I like to say, coercion will turn communion into domination. So to say, will distort the very essence of love. So, and then I will argue on top of that, that if God were to negate love, No, if in other words, if he will override human freedom, being coercive, he will. If God were to negate love, he will cease to be God, because God is love, and that's for me, it's what I call an ontological impossibility. So for me, yeah, every time the voluntary nature of love is denied, love itself is denied. And again, God is love, so God cannot cease to be who he is, and he is love, so he cannot violate love's freedom.
Yeah, so far so good.
Okay, I have 2 more points. Let's see if you check those boxes as well. So basically, yeah, that's the main thesis. And then the conclusion for me is, for me, then divine omnipotence needs to be redefined, at least redefined in connection to those definitions that make omnipotence, like what I would call a hyperbolic omnipotence, that God can do anything and everything. So for me, omnipotence is not so much the God's power to control in the sense of overriding freedom and negating love's voluntary nature, negating himself in the process, but you follow my point, right? So God's power is not shown in domination, but actually, I will say ultimately, his ultimate power is love. And again, love is voluntary.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I think we agree on that. I would just say that, like, God has unlimited power, or at least power to do whatever is logically possible, but because he's also got that, omnipotence is not God's like only quality. He also has the all-loving aspect, and so those have to be harmonized with each other. So whatever God does is also not just consistent with his omnipotence, but also his omnibenevolence as well.
I totally agree with that. And I personally, of course, I don't want to create like a dualistic hierarchy here. Okay, which one of these omnis is more important? But I will argue, especially in our tradition, that the notion of God as loving is especially highlighted.
Yeah.
Even on top, I don't want, again, to create a hierarchy. But if we have to put about omniscience, if we have to put all these omnis on the table, omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence even, and omnibenevolence, I will say that omni-loving, omnibenevolence is kind of one of the most emphasized ones in our tradition, and probably in others as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think, you could have like an evil God who like really has no limitations on what they could do. And in one sense, they're really unconstrained, but I would still prefer like a God like Krishna over that. Even if Krishna voluntarily doesn't do things because it's evil, like, because he's got the goodness, I think that makes him ultimately, it makes it better to have the goodness.
So again, going back to what you mentioned about the importance of not only analyzing omnipotence in a vacuum, like isolated from the other omnis, but contextualizing God's omnipotence by God's omnibenevolence, and vice versa as well. That was the last point of my premise, which was in the light of all the above points I shared, true omnipotence is not the capacity to do just anything, but as I like to call it, the unwavering commitment to remain, for God to remain love in all circumstances.
I think we have to, I guess, keep in mind that Krishna, he's got many qualities, unlimited qualities, and his actions should be consistent with all of them. So if we don't really, if we just focus on the omnipotence, I think you also have to have the omnibenevolence to also, like, you have to have the loving nature also. Krishna's actions have to be in line with that as well.
Yeah. And as I told you, I'm writing a 4th book that may be published next year or something on God's unconditional love, omnibenevolence. So actually, I decided to include a whole chapter of omnipotence and evil and suffering, just to put in context the omnibenevolence of God, because if not, also I felt, okay, there's so much beautiful things that the scriptures say about Krishna's, God's own lovingness, but if I don't bring into the picture this thorny issue, it may sound like a naive intellectual ingenuity. Oh, God is so loving, so beautiful, but what about this? So okay, put his all lovingness in the context of the other qualities plus the suffering in the world, and so on and so forth.
I think the problem of evil, definitely, if we talk about God as loving, we can't just brush that under the rug.
And some devotees told me, because the book already will be maybe like 400 pages, And some people say, Maharaj, but if you write that particular chapter of theodicy and evil and suffering, which ended up being the longest chapter, it may be like almost 100 pages from the 400 pages, so 1/4 of the book. And many say it, but the rest of the book is all about how Krishna is loving and how. So maybe this chapter may take the attention somewhere else. It may be too much. It's quite long. But to be honest, I felt I cannot write a book on God's all lovingness without addressing
Yeah.
the problem of evil. It will be like, for me, incoherent. Even I will say.
Yeah, and I think in general, like it's good just form to address objections or concerns people can have. And so, like, you could write, you know, a long book on God's love, and at the end of it, someone's like, "Well, you just ignored this really important question that really challenges your view, and you didn't say anything about it." It's like, you know, what was the point of this? Like, I still have all these questions, and so I think it's good to address it.
Yeah. And that's why I really appreciate in our tradition of writing and so on. Many, for example, the Goswamis, they will bring. I've been studying Jiva Goswami's Satsandharva and how he brings himself the Purva Paksha or the opposing views. He doesn't even wait some other people to bring the opposing views. He himself constructs better opposing views that probably his actual opponent brings to keep his presentation not only, I will say, consistent, but also like humble and sober in terms of wanting to bring whatever potential arguments may be there to keep everything have intellectual integrity, right?
Good way of putting it, intellectual integrity.
So Adi Purusha, I've been, of course, reflecting a lot while writing on this about love being voluntary, non-coercive, how the Jiva has free will, and that's an intrinsic quality, as we were talking, has agency. You cannot take that out. How God honors that agency. So in that light, you have written a lot about, or maybe not a lot, but a lot. You sent me a long document. So within the Bhakti tradition, we encounter a God who sometimes, let's go for a moment to how Krishna relates to his devotees. On the greater picture of how he relates to everyone, how he relates to those who relate to him, who approach him voluntarily, and sometimes how God can orchestrate some suffering in the life of a devotee. So how do you explain or understand that? And what makes such suffering not cruel, but compassionate?
I think that's really important to bring up. So I mean, Bhagavatam says that Krishna is the control of karma, and all over our shastras it says that Krishna can destroy the karma of his devotees. Even in the Gita, we have the famous verse Sarva Dharmam Parityajya. And so my understanding, and Prabhupada also, I mean, this is basically Prabhupada's understanding and the understanding where Acharya is also, that like Krishna can destroy your karma, but he might leave a token reaction. So you might still have some residual karma, or he might lessen the impact of your karma. Like if you were supposed to get in a car accident as your karma, maybe you get in a car accident, but it's a lot less severe, and or maybe you just get your bumper dinged up or something like that. So that's one idea. But sometimes devotees present it that like it's like when you get suffering, it's like directly Krishna. And you can maybe make the case that like it is directly Krishna, but like also I don't think Krishna, I think it depends on the relationship with his devotee. Like in some cases, it might not be your karma or token karma, and it might just be Krishna. And I think we have to, there's events in our lives that I think we can see in that way. But I think also, like, if there's something really bad, we also shouldn't say, oh, like, Krishna, why are you doing this? Like, I'm trying to devote myself to you, and now you're just, like, making me suffer and causing the suffering to me. I also think, we shouldn't have that attitude, because it's like, maybe that was, like, our karma, but because Krishna sees that we still have, like, a lesson to learn, he still gave us the karma, but he minimized it, so it's sort of the optimal amount for us. And so in that sense, we're still kind of like accountable, because it's like, it's not like this random thing of suffering that has no connection to our actions at all. Like we are still accountable for that in some way, and Krishna's there, and he minimizes it or modifies that karma to the most optimal extent so that we can ultimately benefit from that lesson, however heavy it may be. And so I think while it's true that Krishna destroys karma and he's sort of in charge for the devotees, I do think that like our own personal accountability also is like an important part of that. And if we don't acknowledge that, it could make one resentful to Krishna, or you might unnecessarily blame Krishna for things that are also sort of traceable to your actions as well.
Yeah, and we may not take responsibility for ourselves and somehow start to conceive ourselves without free will again. So
Mm-hmm.
okay, I'm just, everything is coming. I have no choice here. I think that, okay, we have in scripture these statements that, okay, Krishna destroys the karma of his devotee. But sometimes, again, for me, there are degrees of that, because that's applicable to how much we are a devotee, so to say, right? Because what does it mean to be a devotee, right? For me, it's not like a black or white idea, right? What it doesn't mean to be a devotee. Like, I became initiated, or I visited the temple one weekend and I'm no longer beyond karma, or proportionately to how much I take shelter in bhakti, naturally, correspondingly to that, karma is destroyed, which is how it makes sense to me, right? Like Krishna says in the chapter 9 of the Gita, he's saying, Daibim prakriti masritaha mahatmanas tumam partam. He's describing the great souls, which Mahatma, he refers to the devotees as those who take shelter under his divine energy. So there are degrees of taking shelter in bhakti, in my opinion. It's not just like, I took full shelter today, and yesterday I had taken zero shelter, and you follow my point, right?
Yeah, I think that's a bit of a nuanced topic, I think, because I think Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur or Rupa Goswami, they mentioned that even by a little bit of bhakti, like your karma is like completely destroyed. So I do think that even a little bit can destroy your karma, but it's also true that you could do a little bit of, you could chant Hare Krishna a few times and then go on doing like sinful activities or something like that, or like bad karmic activities. And in that sense, like, maybe Krishna burned your karma when you chanted Hare Krishna, but then you sort of stopped thinking of Krishna after that and started doing other things. Like, maybe you can say that, okay, Krishna wiped your karma, but then you like stopped doing devotional activities and just kept on doing other things. And so like, you could wipe that karma again, but if you haven't like devoted yourself to him, you might still be accountable for that.
Yeah, because actually I'm recalling one other section from Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur where he will say something like that he will speak about the spiritualization of this body as much as one is engaged in bhakti, and he will speak very much in proportions, like proportionately to how much you are giving yourself to bhakti, to that same proportion your body is becoming spiritualized, and the proportion that you are not giving yourself to bhakti, that portion is not spiritualized. So yeah, I was thinking about that, but I agree with you. Of course, we have these other statements about the power of bhakti, and we don't want to diminish that. But of course, again, the question is then, what does it mean to do bhakti? But anyhow, that can be a separate podcast. We can do some other day.
Yeah.
I have one question for you, Adi Purusha, going back to the soul, the agency, the devotee, in this case, suffering a particular situation, and someone may say, okay, maybe it's Krishna's arrangement, maybe it's karma. And what comes to my mind, and I want to share something that Srila Prabhupada says, could we speak in terms of a third option between those two, or to nuance some of those two options? Because, for example, once, and I'm reading from the book I'm writing, Prabhupada once illustrated a dynamic understanding of karma in a conversation with one of his disciples, when he was asked whether if someone is attacking me, a disciple asked Prabhupada, if someone is attacking us, should we say, okay, that's my karma and accept it, or should we respond to that, protect ourselves? So when he was asked whether one should passively accept an attack or a deserved karmic reaction, Prabhupada replied, it may be that somebody is attacking even though you do not deserve. And therefore, he said, you have got intelligence, you have got hands, you must try to protect. So my question here will be, here by Prabhupada, this is a conversation he had. I mean, I can share then the specific reference for whomever wants. But Prabhupada seems to be acknowledging that you may be in life and someone is attacking you, and probably that's not necessarily your karma. So how will you interpret that? For example, okay, my karma is more in terms of how do I perceive or process the situation, but the attack itself is just me, a jiva with free will, interacting with the free will of another jiva, but not necessarily to label that as my karma.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I do think there's probably a class of things that can happen to you that aren't your karma. Like if you are on a building and you just choose to fall off, you can't say that's your karma because that's like your free will that you exercised.
Mm-hmm.
In one sense, I mean, maybe it's like karma in a very loose sense, in the sense that you're getting just a consequence of your own free actions there. Similarly, like if you voluntarily choose to enter into a relationship with someone and they're abusive or they're just being mean to you or whatever, in one sense, maybe it's your karma, but maybe it's also, you're freely choosing to enter into this relationship. And if you enter into the relationship, the nature of this person's character is such that they'll do these things to you. So like, is it your karma, or is it just like you're freely choosing to engage with that in that relationship? You can maybe make the sense that it's not like strictly speaking like karma in terms of you do an action, you get these kind of karmic credits that you have to like pay off in some way. So I think there are things that you can maybe just say is like free will rather than karma per se. But it gets interesting when you think about cases like someone attacking you, like maybe it would depend on the details. Like, maybe if you were like doing something and you like angered someone, maybe you gave a really like incendiary or like explosive speech and one of the people got mad and they wanted to attack you afterwards. Like, is that your karma, or is that just a result of your own like actions? Like, you can maybe see that that's a result of your actions. Now, if you're walking on the street and there's like a mugger and it has absolutely nothing to do with like your own free choices, and it's just something that's beyond really not connected to anything you did, like I think we can maybe say that's karma. But there's probably some gray area, like is it your free will, is it karma, like but I think it just makes sense that there would be some things that maybe have more to do with free will, like even just jumping off like a cliff or something. Like you shouldn't blame like karma or Krishna for that.
And of course, the conversation maybe can be more complicated if someone say, okay, it's your free will, but how free is your will? Because your will is also expressed in the context of previous actions, which may speak about karma and the influence of the gunas. And that may be another separate podcast to talk about.
Yeah, that's kind of a lengthy topic, but well, I can say a little bit on that in that.
Yeah. I'm just bringing all these topics, at least also for us to have a glimpse at how complex each one of these issues are, and we do not take them lightly and just use karma in a very simplistic way, or even free will, or any of the things that we may take them for granted, and just have a glimpse as the nuance that is in between them.
Yeah, some people do say that like karma undermines our freedom. And they say that if you like whatever you do, it was like your karma that you did that thing, and it was your karma that like how you responded or whatever. And I would say that like karma kind of determines the circumstances we're in, but how we respond is still up to us. And some people use like the poker hand analogy. Like it's a loose analogy, but the idea is that like karma may determine our hands, but how we play them is like up to us. That analogy breaks down a little bit, because in one sense, like our hands we get is not also random either. Like it does also, if it's our karma, it was also a product of our free choices at some point as well. But the idea is basically like we have the ability to respond to different karmic consequences or reactions that we have in our life. So we still retain the freedom in that sense.
Yeah, because if we play that too much, to play that out to an extreme, karma becomes a whole. I mean, everything becomes too deterministic. We have no free will. And again, we stop being what we are as jivas, with intrinsic quality of agency and so on.
Yeah.
So going back for a moment to your point of God's arranging at times suffering in the life of a devotee with a particular, of course, loving intention. Again, going back to his all benevolence, to not forget that quality. I'm wondering how will you explain, if we accept that as a fact, and again, I know that you have written about it and referred to sections in the Bhagavatam and Mahabharata about different cases where we can make that case. So in cases where some particular devotees undergone severe torture and pain, not only in our Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. I don't like to limit the word devotees to we are the devotees here, but let's take the famous classical example to the Holocaust, where there were many Jewish devotees, if we would like to use that term, undergoing the horrors of the Nazi regime. So, according to your theory or to your way of thinking on this topic, how will you reply to that? Because someone may argue, so do you mean that Yahweh directly orchestrated the concentration camps to bless his devotees, so to say?
Yeah, you chose the.
And I know it's a super complicated topic.
Yeah, I mean, there's like some law that as soon as you start talking about these things, eventually the Holocaust will get brought up. And heavy example, but it does come up a lot. Yeah, there's a mix of things. I mean, maybe there's some karma there, as kind of callous as it sounds. Maybe like there's some people who are, it's sort of Krishna directly doing it somehow or other for their benefit. And, you could maybe say it's a combination of the two. I think we kind of have those three options. There's karma, Krishna, or some combination, where the combination would be maybe you're getting a token reaction. And so in one sense, like it's still traceable to your actions, but Krishna is like personally administering it so that it's like optimized. So in one sense, it's like Krishna's there, he's behind it, but the other hand, like your own choices are also a factor in there as well. So you kind of have those three options to explain that. I mean, you could say that it's just free will and sometimes things just happen, but that's maybe not really in line with the karmic understanding of the world. So you kind of have, those three options, and somehow like it's ultimately beneficial, which sometimes it's really hard to see how something as horrible as that could be beneficial. But I guess like, from our perspective, like going back to Godhead or going back to Krishna is like a multi-life process. And there might be lives that are actually like on the whole, maybe bad for us. Like our suffering in a certain life might actually outweigh the happiness we experience in that life itself. But, if there's lessons being learned or even just impressions being built in the subtle body in those lives, then ultimately in future lifetimes, it can work out. And so, with something like, any kind of instance of suffering, somehow there's karma in the picture. Maybe if you're a devotee, Krishna's like tinkering with the karma to a certain extent, so it's kind of optimal. But, in some cases, it could be Krishna directly and it has nothing to do with your karma at all. But, in many cases, at least from the devotee's perspective, I think even the Bhagavatam encourages devotees to see that it's like somehow karma, even if it's a token reaction.
So how will you personally reply? And probably this happened to you already, to some, not only devotees, but people in you work as a chaplain as well. Like, okay, if God is so loving and I'm trying to serve him, couldn't he have found another more user-friendly way to deal with me in this whatever X situation that was utterly painful or traumatic? How will you reply to that in a sensitive, practical sense and situation also, which may be different to how we may speak sometimes in principle philosophically, right?
Yeah. I find that my intellectual philosophical responses can be very different than my like emotional practical responses. But with regards to that, I think in the lives of devotees, we'll probably all go through the ringer at some point, if not multiple points in our lives. And we go through periods where we're like, oh my God, Krishna, like, why are you doing this? Like, I can't understand why you do this. And in those moments, like I think it's fine to have, feelings about that. Like maybe you do feel frustration. Maybe you do feel challenged. Maybe you do feel angry. Maybe you do just have a lot of frustration built up. And I wouldn't encourage someone to repress that. I don't think they have to express that by getting like offensive or criticizing or getting like wrathful towards God or to others. But I think it's, it's understandable and human to have that emotional response. So I think letting someone actually sit with that, I think is important also. And I think once someone, I think initially they'll, with events like that, like there's initial like extreme outpour of emotion. They might be really frustrated. They might question like how God could allow it. They might like have issues with they might have doubts, challenges in their faith. But I think, as time goes on, I think if that person has extended compassion, and they have time to heal from it, and they have time to sort of process the emotions, I think at a later point, they can look back and say, okay, Krishna, that was really heavy. I went through a lot of that moment. It was a really hard thing for me. But now that I've gone through it, like I've learned this, I've learned that, and it opened up this door, and it opened up that door, and it helped me learn this, and it gave me this perspective. And I think after the fact, maybe even sometime later, you can kind of understand how that event of suffering impacted your life, and maybe even benefited it. But I don't think it's easy to see that in the moment, and I don't think we should like try to preach to people to try to see it in the moment. Oftentimes it just takes time to sort of heal those wounds. And I think the good thing, I mean, what I like about our theology is that, like, there's times in my life where there's also been a lot of suffering, and it's like, in the moment it's kind of difficult, but I think it's helpful to know that, okay, like I can see intellectually why this happened, and it doesn't make me challenge like Krishna's goodness, because I know that ultimately it was for the best. And that realization may take some time to get to, and it doesn't help when you're actually experiencing something in the moment. But I think for me, it does help to know that, okay, like there is like a reason for this. I couldn't accept it at the time, and it took me some time to get it, but I can kind of see that, and I think intellectually that helps. But I don't know if everyone necessarily needs to like resolve it intellectually either. I think but it is, I think, nice to have that like intellectual vantage point as well.
To have a deeper sense of certainty and trust in and hope in the midst of everything else being uncertain, so to say, right?
Yeah, but I think when someone's if you're going through a really difficult time, I think that's, the best response is basically for a devotee to extend their compassion and to just offer a compassionate presence, ask the devotee, how can I help you? This is really hard. Let me know if you want to talk.
Yeah,
I think that goes a longer way emotionally. And then later, as the devotee processes things, I think even just the intuition one gets from within, I think you can sort of make sense of it naturally, even by yourself. But when you're like in a turbulent thing, the emotions can often just like overpower us in the moment.
Yeah. I appreciate you say that, because again, so often sometimes we may resort quickly and cheaply to the notion of, okay, that's your karma, and try to philosophize and that being so violent, instead of engaging with karma compassionately, which actually there are some sections in the Bhagavatam which actually speak about that you should deal with other people's karma in a way that elicits compassion and not the opposite. So
yeah, that's the worst. That's probably one of the worst things you can say to someone. And then I also find that if someone's suffering and like you don't feel compassion or you don't feel empathy, you're probably so overwhelmed in your own life. You've probably been invalidated for your suffering also, and so it's hard to extend that compassion. And so, yeah, it's a bad response to respond to someone suffering in that way. But two, if you are inclined to respond in that way, it does maybe indicate that you've been invalidated in the past, or that you've also overwhelmed with your own stuff and you can't even hold space for someone else's suffering.
Yeah, really appreciate that. And again, that's yet another podcast to speak about, but I appreciate the point of learning to sit with your emotions and learning to. The other day we were celebrating Narasimha Chaturdashi here, and we were making some connection between Prahlad Maharaj's abhayatva, or his fearlessness, and his universal compassion. No, there are all these beautiful prayers he's praying for everyone. I'm making a connection how his fearlessness allowed for the universal compassion, in the sense that he was fearless, which entailed he was open to feel his own thing, his own emotions. So that allowed him to connect with other people's emotions without being terrified about that, and therefore being universally compassionate. Right? But many times, if you are too fearful of whatever you are feeling, what to speak of connecting with what's going on in other person's world, right? So it was an interesting insight that came between fearlessness and compassion.
Yeah, that's a good connection. I like that point.
Yeah. And we went even back to that, okay, how can you be fearless? And one very grounding point, at least from my perspective, is to know yourself to be already loved by God, right? In his omnibenevolence, you're already loved and accepted by Krishna. So on that foundation, gradually I can become fearless. I can know I'm loved and accepted. And from that openness, I can feel whatever I need to feel, as you say, go through the brokenness and emotions that I need to go through as a human being, accepting myself with self-compassion. And then from that acceptance, I can accept other people's emotions in life. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I think God's love and feeling of being loved by God is important. I think to be able to be fearless, to offer compassion to others, and also to have like a healthy emotional life also. Like if you feel loved by God, then whatever insecurities or imperfections you might have, like it doesn't have the same sting to your sense of self-worth.
Yeah, because they're already happening in the context of his love. So he's loving you, so to say, despite all that stuff. So you don't need to fake it or performance and hide. And that for me informs a lot our own spiritual practice, because if we don't have that clear foundation of unconditional love, we may engage in spiritual life as a performance, basically, and trying to earn acceptance, to earn Krishna's love. And many times we stop being who we are, we deny our emotions to be part of the group, so to say, and instead of being vulnerable and acknowledging I am who I am and Krishna already loves me. And on that foundation, I can change, actually. I need to
Yeah.
change things, but I can only change, as Carl Rogers will say, first if I learn to accept myself, knowing that I'm accepted, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing you said I think is worth worth touching on is that, like, in one sense, Krishna reciprocates with us, and there's some endeavor we need to put in our spiritual life to really connect with Krishna. But yeah, I think it's not that we have to like earn or work for Krishna's love. We maybe have to work on ourselves so that we can be more receptive to that love and be able to reciprocate with Krishna's love.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, as devotees, we have a very fruitive mindset sometimes. Like, you'll get love if you distribute this many books.
Transactional.
Or you'll get love if you chant this many rounds. But it's like, Krishna's love is always there for us. It's sort of, he loves us in virtue of who we are.
Yeah.
And, it's up to us to kind of just be able to open ourselves up to that and be able to reciprocate with the love Krishna wants to give to us.
Yeah. Yeah. That's for me the difference between a transactional approach versus a transformative approach. It's not that I need to do all this stuff, I need to be perfect first, but I'm already loved. And that's why I like to say the goal of life for us is not love from God, but love for God. Because love from God is already a given. That's already happening. Now the whole thing is for ourselves to acknowledge that, open ourselves to that, and return the embrace, as I like to say, right? And for me, that really changes the whole framework, orientation, perspective, how we approach spiritual life. And that can really make a difference.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. Like, yeah, it's not that we have to work and do something so that God sort of like decides, oh, okay, I didn't love you before, but now that you like chanted this many rounds, like now I love you. Yeah, that's not really how it works.
That projects such an idea of God that is not God, basically, right? That doesn't make for a very all-loving notion of the divine.
Yeah, it's kind of like that.
I only love you if you do this, if you give me this daily quota of whatever. So it's more conditional than unconditional.
Yeah, he becomes more like the absent father who's like, disappointed with their child and will only love them if they get some like accolade or something.
Yeah, and in many cases, that's a daddy wound that we end up projecting on the divine, and it's our own unresolved childhood issues that filter our even experience of Krishna consciousness. So
yeah,
now you get an idea why I'm choosing to write a whole book about unconditional love.
Yeah, no, it's an important topic.
I think can really make a difference. Yeah. You were mentioning Adi Purusha some minutes ago, going back to what we were talking. At one point, you said in terms of Krishna interacting with his devotees, that sometimes some things may happen in our life and someone may ask, okay, why Krishna you are doing this too much or whatever. But also, do you think there may be a place to think that may not be Krishna doing that? That's just, again, whatever is going on, the other person's free will, the dynamics of the relationship. Krishna still is there accompanying me, nourishing me, loving me. But it's not necessarily that, how to say, that God has a plan, in the sense of Krishna has the whole plan from A to Z, how things should happen and unfold, but more of a co-creation, so to say. Again, bearing in mind the free will point. Like Krishna
Yeah,
also wants to honor our free will and invites us to think for ourselves and participate. Like, I don't know, Krishna at the end of the Gita telling Arjuna, okay, now you decide for yourself what you think best, and so on.
yeah. I think that's why it's important to kind of see things like, to take some accountability for things that happen to us also. Like, yes, like Krishna's in charge, and for a devotee he destroys the karma. But every time you suffer, one shouldn't think, oh, Krishna, like this is all your fault. I think there's also room to say, okay, Krishna, like I might have done something, or I must have done something, and I deserve something far worse. But because you're very kind, you've reduced the karma, and you've still, there's still something there. There's still some pain, but ultimately that's for my benefit. But ultimately also, like, it's not that you just woke up one day and said, hey, I'm just going to like cause this person suffering to purify them. It's like, no, like it's also something I'm accountable for. So like, I think if there is the idea of taking some accountability for the suffering on account of it being like token karma, I think psychologically that does transfer some of the accountability to yourself, which I think should make one like not blame God as much. And yeah, I think it's, Krishna, he doesn't just like, he works with the Jiva. The Jiva has their free will. I think if a Jiva has their boundaries, if a Jiva is just like, I'm only this surrendered, I only want your interaction and involvement with my life this much, I only have a certain capacity for suffering, I would think Krishna would honor that.
Yeah.
And we even see there's devotees who, they don't have so much suffering in their lives. Everyone has some, but they might have comfortable lives. They might not be as surrendered, but maybe that's just where they're at. Like they're doing a little bit of bhakti, they're living pious lives. They're surrendered to a certain extent, but maybe they're not ready for like a really heavy experience. Whereas we see with other devotees, like they're surrendered and they sometimes get the full like fire hose of like stuff coming at them. And Krishna maybe sees that, okay, this devotee can handle it. Like I'll put the purification like full force because I know they won't. I know they can handle it, and they're ready for it, and they're accepting of it. And I think Krishna honors each jiva's boundaries. And
I'm thinking of Bhagavad Gita 4:11, the Atman Prapadante, you say, as you approach me, I reciprocate accordingly. So that line could be read in this context regarding to what you are explaining also, right?
Yeah.
And also I'm thinking it's important to make the case that it doesn't mean that, okay, if someone is suffering, a devotee is suffering extremely, that means he's necessarily more surrendered than those who are having a more quiet life.
Yeah,
because that's a symptom that Krishna knows he can handle more, and he's giving him more, and he's more. So you follow my point, right?
Yeah. That's good clarification. Like it really depends on the person. It could be the person suffering a lot isn't surrendered either. But so many factors: their karma, their free will, their level of surrender. It's all a very like individualized, personalized.
Yeah. At the end of the day, as I like to use the term radical personalism, the whole journey of every soul in their relationship with God is ultra specified and unique and irrepeatable. So we cannot just apply one size fits all and apply a pattern. Everything works in the same way. There are codes and universal laws, as we were talking, but how that takes shape in each case is very, very unique, right? You were talking in one of your writings you share with me, and you mentioned that briefly. I'd like to go there for a moment, about how suffering, going to the point of suffering for a moment, which again is an experience that all of us know. Suffering, how often suffering can deepen devotion, or how often suffering can awaken moral insight, right? You share with me this paper by, what's her name, Jessica Hemberg?
Yeah, Jessica Hemberg, I think
so, yeah. So where she's exploring in the study that you share with me, how people, at least in the research she made, people who endure personal suffering often report an increased sense of gratitude, deeper empathy, richer awareness of life's fragility and meaning. At the same time, I don't know if you would like to elaborate briefly on that also.
Yeah, I think it's kind of heavy as it may be, suffering can often benefit us in many ways.
Mhm.
I mean, one, we get experiential sensitivity, which, as you said, can awaken some moral insights. So, like, if you've been in poverty and you've experienced it firsthand, you know what it feels like and you know how bad it is. And if you walk by the street and you see a homeless person, you might have more compassion because you realize, oh my God, like I've been there. I know how bad it is. Like I know what that person's going through, and therefore,
Mm.
I want to help them because I know how hard it is to be in that. I think karma does that to someone. If you go through heavy things, or I guess suffering, does that to someone. If you go through heavy things, you do learn something out of it usually. If nothing else, you at least have an awareness of how painful that suffering is, and that ideally should make one want to reduce that suffering just because they know firsthand how bad it is. But also humility can humble one.
Mhm.
There's a certain degree of gratitude. If you've suffered a lot, then when you do have things go good, you kind of can appreciate it more. I mean, one thing in our tradition, which is a little bit, Eastern traditions have a little bit more of a, I don't want to say pessimistic attitude towards the material world, but maybe in one sense a realistic attitude where, like, this world is suffering. It can be full of joy. It depends on your attitude to a large extent. But
Yeah.
there's birth, death, old age, disease. There's negative things here. There's exploitation. There's envy. There's so many things. And ultimately, we want to orient ourselves to Krishna. And if you're having a really comfortable life, you might just get a little bit complacent in this world and not really see the pitfalls of this world. And so if you suffer a lot, it can kind of make you say, oh my God, like, this world, like, this is not my true home. Like, I ultimately belong with Krishna. And it can get you to orient yourself to seek out a relationship with Krishna rather than try to stay here too long or stay here with a material consciousness for too long.
Mm. That opens the door to another podcast inside the podcast, a meta podcast here, because of course I get your point, Adi Purusha, on a so-called pessimistic view in relationship to the material world. But I personally also feel that it's important to highlight that the material world in itself is not bad. It's not ontologically evil. It's an energy of God, ultimately, which is dedicated to his service. So, how much, even if we want to use the word Maya Shakti, that's a Shakti of Bhagavan, which is serving Bhagavan, probably serving Bhagavan more than what I'm serving Bhagavan. So, and there are many sections in the scripture that also speak about the sacredness of matter and how God inhabits even every atom. So in one sense, we could also make the case, Brahma Samhita says Krishna is in every atom. So how can I say this world is bad? Or I think I'm saying is, when we say the material world, for me it's more a state of consciousness than matter itself, so to say.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess, like, to be in the material world means to be in this world with material consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
There's the quote, what is it? Atmavan
Manyate Jagat.
Atmavan Manyate Jagat. You sort of see the world according to your own psychology. And for a
Yeah.
devotee, it's blissful because they can serve Krishna. But I guess for the average jiva, they do have their conditioning, and their engagement with the world is one of more material one. And for that does involve a certain degree of suffering to the extent that you're materially
Yeah.
conditioned. So yeah, I guess I would qualify that when we talk about being in the material world and the material world being miserable. It's sort of like miserable from the standpoint of someone who's deeply conditioned by it and hasn't turned towards Krishna or doesn't see Krishna in it fully yet.
Exactly. Because again, at the end of the day, we find our tradition that when the different adhikars or different levels of eligibility of a devotee are described, in one sense, they are described in terms of our capacity to see God in this world, right? The Kanishta adhikar only sees God in the deity. The Madhyama adhikar sees God in other people. And the Uttam adhikar sees God everywhere. So in one sense, it's interesting how the advancement in bhakti is also defined. There are different ways to define it. One of them is how much you can find God here, so to say, right? So for me, that's brings us back to the point. It ultimately is more a state of consciousness than matter being ontologically bad. Actually, you can relate to matter with a proper consciousness, and matter will act as a portal to the divine. Also, you can perceive the presence of God even, and that's an important point that I find in the Bhagavatam. that many times the beginning of most of the sessions starts by a description of the world, like the Virat Rupa or other sections that speak of the world in connection to God. So trying to make us see the world with God within it, or the world within God, if you will. No? So
Yeah,
anyhow,
those are all good.
again,
Yeah,
it's
those are all
another
good.
podcast altogether, but it's an
Yeah,
interesting
yeah,
conversation.
those are good points. It's in one sense, yeah, this world is only as material as our consciousness.
So going back to the point of suffering and to Jessica Hambert's article, I recall also something that, and a striking point from that article is one of her findings was that those who have suffered deeply, and again, I don't want here to make any claims of victim consciousness. I suffer deeply more than you, but I know what suffering is, and I will say, on one level, everyone has suffered. Learning from the suffering, it's another thing, another conversation. But she will say those who have suffered deeply often say, she will say that they wouldn't want to undo their pain, right? Because the pain made them who they were. So that's interesting, and I think you mentioned in one of your writings you went to Kunti Devi's example, praying for Vipadas and Tatasasvat, which again shouldn't be misconstrued by promotion of masochism or anything. so how will my question here, some question that is coming now, is how will you make sense of all that? And a statement from the Bhagavad Gita 9.2, for example, where Krishna says, Susukam Kartum, bhakti is to be engaged with lots of joy and happiness.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess bhakti is very joyful. The suffering we might experience while practicing bhakti might not be joyful, but I guess the devotional acts themselves are very blissful. And I guess for a pure devotee with like really pure consciousness, even the suffering is sort of a way for them to deepen their devotion. So I guess for a pure devotee, even that is blissful in one sense. But I mean, in one sense, I guess if you look back on your life and you can process and integrate the suffering into your life in a healthy way, that might even be one might become grateful for intense suffering. In one sense, that could maybe deepen their appreciation for Krishna, although that often takes a lot of time and maturity to be able to do that. And I think this is maybe not quite related to your points, but as you're mentioning people who value their suffering, I think it also depends. Like, I think to benefit from your suffering, if there's some trauma that you carry and it's unprocessed, you might not value the suffering. So I guess like processing the trauma is an important part of actually healing from suffering and coming to appreciate and engage with it. And I guess it's not always that someone will benefit from their suffering. If they carry a lot of trauma, they might still be affected by it. But I think if you can process that, then I think you can often look back and say, okay, like that was really bad, but I did learn so much and it made me who I am. And I'm ultimately grateful for where it led me to where I am today. Even if you're not like on the level of Queen Kunti, I think we can arrive at those realizations, although it often takes a lot of work. But I guess for someone like Queen Kunti, it's like, they're so exalted that like they can go through so much intense stuff and still just like see Krishna through it all.
So warning to our listeners, do not imitate Kunti, but still you can draw some inspiration from that. And yes, as you say, as I like to say also, like the goal of life is actually not to stop suffering, because that may be naive and unrealistic, but the goal will be to learn from suffering whenever it comes. Not that we are, again, imitating Kunti and praying for suffering or calamities from one way or another, but whenever that happens to come, and it will come, it will knock our door, how we can draw lessons from that, right? How to learn from suffering, or how to learn to suffer, if you will, because actually in our tradition, our goal is not mukti, our goal is not transcending even samsara. Actually our tradition, Mahaprabhu will say, Mama janmani janmanishvare bhavatad bhakti rahaitukitvaye. I don't care for being born, coming here over and over again. Of course, it's Mahaprabhu, and that verse speaks about the level of ruchi. So again, we may not be to imitate that, but in principle, our teaching is not so much like, okay, the goal of bhakti is kind of an evacuation plan into the afterlife. But it's more to be so much immersed in loving service that you no longer care whether I'm coming or not coming. So my point with all this is also that sometimes, and I can understand in some stage of the practice we are practicing, and the main orientation is I want to stop suffering. Krishna says in the Gita, one of the 4 people that come to me are the afflicted ones, so I can totally be empathic with those who really need a break, after being broken so much. But ultimately, the goal is not to stop suffering, but to learn to integrate suffering and find meaning in suffering. Because if I pay attention to the dynamics in the eternal life in our tradition, and Radha and Krishna on the daily meetings of union and separation, in that separation, there's lots of suffering. It's not that they are making a show of suffering. They're actually suffering, but in a way that is sweet, in a way that enhances love, in a way that expands the heart. So for me, that's what it gets interesting, where we can talk about a sense of paradoxical suffering, that suffering can be sweet, suffering can be meaningful, suffering can be even in eternity. But of course, for us to, how to say, to find inspiration in going to a place for eternity where there will be suffering, we need to make sense of suffering here and now, in a way that we can already have a glimpse of, suffering can really be meaningful, can enrich my life, can expand my consciousness, can have its own paradoxical sweetness. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that it's true. We're not, those who are just aimed at liberation, one of their main motivations is just to get free from suffering. And for us, we might be motivated by that in the beginning, but to be free from suffering, I guess, requires that you're either in the Brahma Jyoti, which is ultimately boring for the soul, or like a rock or something. So suffering is kind of, it's, just part of the package of being alive, I guess. But the question is maybe not trying to avoid it, but to be able to handle it in a way that it doesn't really affect us as bad. And I guess the pure devotees, they're experiencing suffering, but by that point, their consciousness is so transformed that it's just whatever they experience is like blissful. And even when they're suffering, it's like a suffering, but it's like a spiritual emotion that gives them joy. So ultimately, the residents of Vrindavan, they're always in anxiety and distress, especially when they're separated from Krishna. But so we can't avoid suffering even in the spiritual world, but at least we can purify our consciousness so that like the suffering is like, well, I guess maybe there's 2 things. One, worldly suffering won't affect us as much. And 2, like even when you suffer in the spiritual world, like it's still not, it's categorically different, I guess, and still a source of joy. And so, that's ultimately our goal, is to experience these spiritual emotions rather than just avoid any type of feeling altogether.
Yeah. Like I like to sometimes remind myself and others when, for example, Rupa Goswami, he described these 5 main rasas, of course, Shanta, Dasya, Sakya, Vatsalya, but then he goes to the 7 secondary rasas, and one is fear, one is anger, right? One is disgust. So they are not necessarily positive in the way we tend to think about them, but they exist then in eternity, assisting the main emotions. So there must be, of course, a proper way to embrace those things even in eternity. So it's important, I will say, for us here and now, when we are, how to say, training for eternity and eternal life. How are we dealing here and now with anger, with fear, disgust, suffering, pain, in a way that it's integrative, so to say. It can hold its existence in eternity, so to say, because there is a place for that, for what we can see in the Lila, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of the indirect rasas, like they're not things we associate with being like positive things, like disgust or anger, but your Prabhupada also talked about, devotees also get angry, but their anger is because maybe a devotee is offended or because Krishna's been offended, and it's sort of like a righteous anger that's there to defend or to stand up or to protect, like devotees.
Set boundaries,
Yeah.
What I was thinking about suffering, also something, and I kind of avoid thinking about Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, because he in his book he makes this point that the goal of life is not to be happy. He will say the goal of life is to find meaning, whether you're happy and whether you're not happy. And of course, he went through the Holocaust, and he has lots of experience at finding meaning when you are not happy. So I was thinking about, okay, and interestingly for me, in Sanskrit, the word for meaning, one of those is artha, and also we use artha in connection to prem purushartha, like the goal of life, the ultimate necessity, the ultimate wealth. So purpose, meaning, and love can go hand by hand. When you have love, even suffering makes sense, so to say. You can suffer in eternity and you can derive meaning from that. But my question will be, what of those moments where we may know in principle everything has a purpose, there is meaning inherent in everything, including suffering, but when we are not able to draw that meaning and somehow we are in a mystery situation of unknowing, of uncertainty, what will you say in terms of that? What role does mystery play in our theology? Can not knowing be sacred?
Yeah, I think, during moments of suffering, I don't think we need to have it all figured out then. Sometimes you just have to process what's happened, move forward, and try to make a constructive effort to try to work with what's been given to you and maybe go forward in the midst of suffering. I think as far as the lessons, I think you can also, if you suffered a lot, you might think, oh my God, like I suffered so much, like why did Krishna allow me? But I think even with a little bit of introspection and some time down the road and maybe having processed things, you can say, okay, I think you can just ask yourself, okay, what did I learn from this? And I think in some cases it's, there's some things that are very much like very easily that come to mind very easily. I think, okay, now that I think about it, this happened and that was good. This happened and I learned this lesson. This opportunity opened up because that happened. And I think you can just, there's a little bit of introspection. You can kind of see, but it often takes time and it's very hard to do in the moment. But I think with time and with some introspection and I think japa to get some insight from Krishna, I think we can make a little bit more sense of these things. Devotees can also help, but sometimes you have to be a little bit careful. Sometimes when you're in the midst of suffering, devotees want to really intellectualize it and point out all the ways it's Krishna's arrangement. That's not always helpful. But devotees can be a good resource to try to understand things. I think also your own introspection and intuition from insight from Krishna can help with a lot of things as well.
Yeah. And also I'm thinking about, okay, sometimes suffering is going on in our lives, in someone else's life. We may not be very clear about why this is taking place. There's still some confusion or some bewilderment or some unknowing. And sometimes we may invoke, as I like to say, the mystery card too soon. Like instead of trying to be there, be accepting or trying to understand, we're just like, well, it's mystery, we don't know, it's for your greater good. And but sometimes I agree with invoking the mystery card at some point, always, because at some point things are always mystery. They're always beyond our understanding, our grasp. But also, I would say there's the temptation of invoking that mystery card too soon, which will spoil the whole deck, I will say, if you do that. So which are your thoughts on that in dealing with some situations?
That's a good question. In some sense, it maybe depends. I think sometimes there's just things we can't realize or know yet. And I think with time, those become more clear. I think sometimes we maybe know more than we give ourselves credit for. I think one thing that's good about our theology, or that I like about our theology, is I do find that it's easier to find ways to understand my suffering because there's a big picture and there's a goal of where Krishna's taking us towards. And just the idea of like, we need to be sort of pure from our anarthas. And, you can kind of, it's sometimes, maybe hard to understand why something happened in the grand picture of things, but sometimes it's easier to see, okay, at least like this anartha that I have, like I notice that it's less. So at least we can make some progress with, I guess, some introspection and maybe some guidance. But yeah, I guess, it's maybe not so much of a mystery as much as it's like I guess okay, maybe I take that back. It is a mystery, but it's a mystery that gets less mysterious over time. Over time, as we go through life, we can kind of see, okay, like I see why it was good that this happened, because that happened, this happened. And maybe as we're introspective, like, it doesn't have to remain a mystery. So in that sense, it's good. I think also, though, I think there's also, I think when someone has been really beat down by this world, there's a certain safety that we really long and crave for. And one might even really want to have a really safe, clean picture of the world because it offers a sense of security. I think sometimes sitting with mystery can be hard because there's like this tension and we don't know, and it like we don't feel as secure or safe because there's just this thing that is on our mind and we can't make sense of it. But I guess like the more we advance and trust in Krishna, the more or process different events that happen to us, the more we can kind of be like, okay, I don't understand what's going on. I don't know why this is happening, but I can sit with it because I know Krishna is ultimately taking care and he's got a plan. And also, I think the more Krishna pulls through in our life, and the more we just experience Krishna's goodness and experience things working out over time, we might encounter something and it's like, okay, I don't understand what's going on here, but so many times I didn't understand and it worked out in the end. And so I think you naturally can respond to things with a little bit more like faith and trust because you just have so much experience of things working out in the past. And so it's like, maybe it's a mystery, but it's a mystery just like all the other mysteries that got solved in the past. So it's not something that's like deeply troubling, but just, something you don't have the ability to make sense of at the moment.
Yeah, I'm reminded of one quote, but Christian theologian Henry Nouwen, he will say, if we have a deep certainty about God's unconditional love, we can be okay dealing with everything else being uncertain, right? So again, many things may still be a mystery, but if I have some deep experience of God's love, that's enough for me to be okay with many things being out of my control, not understandable, being beyond my reach, because I have this deep, clear certainty and experience of, again, going full circle to God's main attribute, his all lovingness, right?
Yeah, I like that. And yeah, it's also, I mean, at least for me, it's easy to say in theory, it's harder to put into practice, but I do think,
I'm not saying it's easy for me. It's easier.
yeah. But no, that's definitely true. The more you feel the more you're deep in your relationship with Krishna and feel that love, then yeah, uncertainty becomes easier to manage and you just feel secure even in the most insecure situations if you have a strong foundation in God.
So since you mentioned that, Adi Purusha, and being mindful of our time and wrapping up, by the time this podcast is shared, you'll likely be holding your first newborn baby. So first of all, congratulations for that.
Thank you.
And considering everything we have discussed so far, evil, suffering in the world, karma, divine love, God's omnibenevolence, how do you feel about inviting a soul as a father into this world? Has your impending fatherhood changed the way you contemplate theodicy, trust, divine intention?
Yeah, I'm sure when the baby's like
I may
really
need to ask
grown.
you this question when the baby is
Yeah,
born. Of course, we may
but
need to do another podcast. But
yeah,
so far.
but I do feel, yeah, I do feel that I think being in a situation where you're responsible, well, I mean, largely responsible for another living being's welfare, I think it does bring something out of you or out of me. It's like you feel like a certain heightened level of responsibility, and I'm already feeling that. Like I'm noticing there's some changes in just like my outlook. I think it matures you very strongly. Yeah, I mean, it is a very powerful maturation, I guess is the word, experience. Yeah, there's like responsibility there, but there's also anticipation and it's also a very rewarding experience to be able to really guide a living being in this world. And it's, as devotees, we also see it as our service to Krishna. And so yeah, it's a very powerful service because very few people have as much impact on you as your parents. And so you're really able to make a very profound impact, either for good or for worse, to another living being. And so that's yeah, it's a very empowering experience in that sense, because you you have a lot of power to shape the once it's destiny of the soul, I mean, of course they have their free will, they have their karma, Krishna is also there, but the way you parent them makes a really big impact on their life. And I think that can be very empowering. And it's a very powerful way to serve.
Yes, you mentioned the word responsibility a few times. I always like to reframe, I mean, not reframe, but actually go to the essence of that and divide the word as responsibility, right? So what's my ability to respond to this new situation, whatever that may be? And and I'm sure also as much as you are guiding, you will be guiding your newborn eventually. The baby will end up being a guru for the parents in so many ways as well, right? It's always reciprocal, right? So I'm sure there will be so much insight. I always ask many of my friends about that, like, okay, how it felt when you felt when you first saw your baby, because I'm a sannyasi, so I have no experience in that field. And of course it was very transformational. All of them told me that, and how that transformed them in terms of responsibility and awareness and empathy. And it's beautiful, and it's beautiful for me to hear that as a sannyasi, and to of course ask myself, okay, I'm not, I mean, in the context of my lifestyle and vows, I'm not having biological progeny, but how I am supposed to embrace that same heightened responsibility from my particular ashram, so to say. No, so it's an important question for all of us, whether we have kids or not. That was my point.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, as devotees, taking responsibility helps us come to a higher level. Because when you take on responsibility, there's a strength or ability in you that really fully emerges in response to the needs of the situation. And I think as sannyasis, it's also important to have like sannyasi, grihastha, vanaprastha, even brahmachari. I think it's important to have responsibility. Otherwise, I think one can become kind of weak in character without having, without having something to keep you accountable, without having some challenge to rise to. Otherwise, it's very common. I mean, especially nowadays, you can just you can waste so much time on like social media and this thing
It's
and
so
that thing.
shallow, right? Shallow
Yeah,
without depth.
yeah, you can stay at a very like shallow level in your just personal growth, not even what to speak of spiritual life, without some responsibility. So I think that's important. I mean, sannyasis, a lot of them have incredible amounts of responsibility. If you're a guru, you have an incredible amount of responsibility also. And even if you don't have disciples, I mean, there's projects and people depend on you, and the words you speak can have a really strong impact on someone. So that also carries a large amount of responsibility.
But as you say, that's not much different from the responsibility of a father, of a mother, in terms of the impact to the newborn. So at the end of the day, we all have our responsibility, our lessons to learn. So thank you for that. So before we put our discussion to rest, Adi Purusha, any concluding thoughts you would like to share with our audience? Any takeaway, whatever you feel inspired?
We touched on a lot of things. We could have many podcasts within the podcasts on some of the topics you raised, but I think to sum it up, the problem of evil, in a nutshell, poses a question like, if God exists, why is there so much suffering in the world? You would think a loving God would want to prevent that suffering. And the Gaudiya Vaishnava or Chaitanya Vaishnava tradition says that God is loving, and love requires free will. And so God supports or gives us free will so that we can ultimately come to love him freely. And with free will comes the potential to misuse free will. But Krishna has, in his kindness, structured this world so that we get consequences to our actions based on the moral quality of those actions. And so if we do good, good will come to us. If we act wickedly, wicked things will happen to us. That's ultimately meant to purify us and help us learn to develop the character we need to be with Krishna and be happy eternally. And when we do suffer, it's very hard. I don't want to trivialize anyone's suffering. But ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, it has a purifying effect on us that ultimately benefits us. And that's maybe there from the intellectual perspective, but There's also an emotional component to suffering, and that's a whole podcast series in itself. But basically, I think with responding to suffering, it's important to acknowledge one's emotions, to have people who one can trust and turn to, and to be able to process one's emotions and suffering in a healthy way in a supportive environment, so that ultimately one can learn those lessons down the road when they've sort of processed everything.
Thank you. Thank you for that piece of wisdom, concluding wisdom, and all the wisdom you shared today. And again, deep gratitude for accepting the invitation to join us today in our Free Radical podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for the viewers who are watching and for
looking forward to the 10 more podcasts that we already basically brought up to our conversation.
Yeah.
Future. Thank you so much.
Great.